I was standing in the Tokyo train station, staring at a ticket machine, and I felt completely illiterate. The screen was just this alien maze of hiragana, katakana, and kanji. I couldn't do it. Couldn't buy a simple train ticket. People were just flowing around me, effortlessly, but I was stuck, frozen, just this crushing isolation. And I realized I'd become the very thing I always hated. The bumbling, obnoxious tourist, totally lost, feeling like I just didn't belong. Then, like just 1 week later, I'm in this small house in rural Seio. My sake glass is never empty. A local man I've known for maybe an hour, a man I cannot share a single word with, he drunkenly passes me his phone. I look at the screen, this clumsy translation app thing, and it says, I'm in Hawaii. He's not in Hawaii. I'm definitely not in Hawaii. And in that moment, as we both just sort of belly laughing, I realized that everything I thought I knew about language and connection, it was completely wrong. That moment, right, that whiplash between feeling totally alone in like the world's most hyper-connected city and then feeling this profound belonging in a remote rural home. That's really the tension we're diving into today. The core question is really, how do you build connection? How do you belong in a culture where you don't speak the language? And, what are the deep sociological forces at play that decide if that language barrier feels like that crushing, isolate, like that Tokyo train station moment? Or if it actually becomes something else, maybe even a catalyst for a deeper connection, like that accidental comedy in the rural house. We've looked at quite a bit of research contrasting urban and rural integration. It's really fascinating work on how status and expectation globally kind of dictate whether communication is going to fail or maybe flourish.
Yeah, it's an incredible mission, really, because it forces us to look beyond just vocabulary lists and grammar rules. It pushes us to focus instead on human behavior. How do people actually connect? So our task here is to analyze the real mechanisms of cultural integration. We'll be primarily contrasting these high-density urban centers with the more remote rural communities, and Japan is just such a powerful case study for this. And we absolutely need to unpack this phenomenon of linguistic privilege, that sort of invisible backpack of advantages that some travelers, especially English speakers, carry around, and really see how that privilege impacts their willingness or maybe even their fundamental ability to truly immerse themselves and, break through to find that genuine connection. #tag Afmana, the invisible backpack of linguistic privilege.
Okay, so let's start right there, where the isolation began for me. Standing in front of that ticket machine.
That frustration, it wasn't just about the Japanese I didn't know. It felt deeper. It was almost about the English I was unconsciously sort of expecting to be there as a fallback. It was the sudden, really jarring awareness of what our sources are calling this almost gravitational pull of native English speaker privilege.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. Gravitational pull. Because the global reality is that English operates, well, not just as a common language. It functions more like critical infrastructure in many ways. It is the lingua franca, or as some specialists actually prefer to call it, the lingua anglica, because its dominance isn't just transactional, like for buying things. It's systemic. It's embedded. And this is particularly overwhelming in certain specialized sectors, international finance, for example, high-level academia, and crucially for the modern world, technical fields. Think computer engineering.
Right, computer engineering.
Right.
What makes English so dominant there? Is it just that the terms originated in English or something more? It's partly the origin, but it's more about efficiency and standardization now. Technical communication often demands incredible precision and, frankly, conciseness. Our research highlighted this. Trying to teach, say, complex networking concepts in a language like French, it would just be far too verbose, too wordy. Compared to the established English terminology and structures, which have become the default, English offers this kind of standardized, internationally recognized shorthand for digital and scientific concepts. And this standardization, ironically, creates a kind of monopoly. It makes monolingualism in English a massive, often totally invisible competitive advantage for native speakers. And this advantage, it translates directly into these extraordinary convenience perks for travelers. Just think about the basics. The infrastructure of global travel English translations are pretty much standard on hotel signs, menus in major tourist spots, ATMs, international travel apps. This dramatically minimizes the friction of just getting around. It almost eliminates that baseline anxiety about, can I communicate? Can I function?
Yeah, I mean, if you're traveling in most of Western Europe or East Asia, you rarely have to really worry about whether your credit card will work or if you'll get hopelessly lost finding the airport. It just lowers the cognitive load of basic survival, doesn't it?
Precisely. It minimizes the worry. That's the key perk. But, and this is a huge but, this convenience has a profound, almost corrosive downside, especially for the long-term traveler or the expat. We sometimes call it the survival instinct deficit. Because English is almost always there as a potential fallback, native English speakers often have very little pressure, very little survival pressure, to actually master the local language. They can kind of afford to be linguistically lazy, if you will, and this makes it incredibly difficult to break out of that comfort zone when they genuinely want to live abroad and integrate.
It's like this trap of easy competence, right? Why spend 3 years struggling to reach intermediate fluency when you can just get by right now with a pointing finger, an English phrase, and maybe a translation app?
Exactly. And the sources are clear. This isn't just about convenience. It's also about avoiding that intense psychological discomfort of feeling incompetent. Let's face it, language learning is inherently humbling. You sound like a child sometimes. And for a native English speaker who is kind of accustomed to this global linguistic dominance, that sudden shift to being unable to communicate basic needs like buying that train ticket, it causes immediate cognitive dissonance, frustration, which naturally reinforces the desire to just retreat back to the familiar, back to English.
And this privilege, it goes beyond just convenience, doesn't it? It extends into really practical economic areas too. It's not just feeling comfortable, it's actual economic leverage. When you're traveling or living abroad, you become hyper aware of these pre-established advantages you carry. Things like easy access to global digital resources, professional networks online, and maybe most strikingly, this profound job market mobility.
Oh, that job market mobility is a huge one. It's a tangible privilege that fundamentally changes the integration experience for many. Think about someone moving to a country like Spain or even Japan, as in your story. A native English speaker can often almost immediately find work. Teaching English is the classic example, right? Or working at an international hostel, maybe giving private language lessons. They have these instant accessible job prospects simply because of their linguistic capital. Their native language is a valuable commodity. And this is a massive structural advantage, particularly when you compare it to local natives in that same age group who might be struggling intensely to find any employment, especially during a local economic downturn. This is a textbook example of converting linguistic capital directly into powerful economic capital.
It's the ultimate safety net, isn't it? And it feeds directly into the mental expectation we bring with us when we travel. Like, before we even step on the plane, we've used the internet all in English to research everything. Maps, hotel reviews, things to do. We basically construct this sense of virtual familiarity before we even arrive.
And here's where the clash happens. This is critical. Travelers arrive expecting what we sometimes term an English-speaking environmental bubble, especially within those hospitality and transit sectors, because they've built up this extensive virtual familiarity online. They've seen the 360-degree tours, read the English TripAdvisor reviews, booked the flight using English interfaces, the whole 9 yards. They subconsciously expect this digital comfort zone to just manifest itself physically when they land. But when that reality is shattered, when the environment refuses to accommodate them, like that ticket machine written only in Japanese script, it leads to immediate culture shock, real profound frustration. The traveler suddenly realizes their virtual familiarity was just a facade. They're faced with the real, complex, non-accommodating world, and often it feels like a personal slight, almost. Like, why isn't my privilege being recognized here?
Yeah.
#2. The urban versus rural immersion challenge in Japan.
Yeah, that clash between the virtual expectation and the, let's say, the messy reality. It leads us right into that contrast from my opening story. The dense, maybe impersonal urban environment of Tokyo versus the tight, traditional social structure you find in rural Seio. We need to really define the fundamental structural differences that make integration feel so different in those two places. Let's start with the city.
Okay, let's break down the urban experience. Think Tokyo, Osaka, maybe Fukuoka. On the surface, these places are magnets for global talent, right? They offer an abundance of international communities. They're absolutely packed with expat bars, networking events, language exchange meetups, hobby clubs specifically catering to foreigners. So finding a social circle based on a common language like English or a shared interest. Initially, it seems relatively easy.
Right, so technically the language barrier might seem easier to navigate at first because you have bilingual signs, international services, all these English-speaking groups. But this leads to one of the most interesting sociological things we looked at, this idea of the isolation paradox.
That's exactly right. Despite being literally surrounded by millions, 14 million in Tokyo's case, the sheer density and the pace of urban life, it's relentless. You've got the demanding corporate work culture, these incredibly long commutes, the general anonymity. It actually fosters an intense sense of isolation for many. Cities tend to operate more on transactional relationships, quick interactions. And locals, who are often accustomed to a high turnover of foreigners, people staying just for a year or two on a work contract, They might hesitate, understandably, to invest the deep social effort needed to form genuine, lasting connections. That perception of a substantial language barrier, or maybe even just cultural difference, it becomes a convenient excuse for non-investment on both sides, perhaps. So you might end up with thousands of acquaintances in Tokyo, but forming those kinds of reciprocal foundational friendships, the ones necessary for true belonging, that can be extremely challenging.
Professionally, though, the city is still the undisputed center of the Japanese economy.
Right.
That's the pull.
Oh, absolutely. It is the hub for career growth. Tokyo and Osaka dominate sectors like technology, finance, specialist services. Our data showed really high demand for IT professionals, for instance, and a notable increase, almost 9%, 8.9% actually, in communication industry job postings year over year. So if you want high earning potential, career specialization, that kind of thing, the city is where you need to be. And the lifestyle convenience, it's simply unparalleled. Tokyo boasts over 200 major shopping malls. Think about that. Its railway system handles over 14 million passengers daily. It's a marvel of efficiency. But you trade that convenience for often high levels of stress, a real lack of personal space, and incredibly high costs of living.
Okay, so now let's pivot. We look at the rural experience, the Inaka, like where I was in Seio. The immediate linguistic barrier feels, well, obviously much higher.
Oh, the initial demands on the foreigner are immense. Way higher. Fewer people are proficient in English, sometimes hardly anyone in smaller villages. This forces a much more proactive, almost sink-or-swim approach to learning Japanese. You have to engage. And this linguistic gap becomes really compounded when you're dealing with high-stakes scenarios, things like medical emergencies, setting up utilities, maybe legal issues where precision is absolutely crucial. It's also further complicated by the fact that regional dialects and unique accents are really common in rural Japan. Even intermediate Japanese speakers from, say, Tokyo might struggle to understand the local way of speaking.
Wow, okay. It sounds incredibly difficult on paper. Yet, the sense of belonging people often describe finding in the countryside is usually portrayed as profoundly deeper than in the city. Why is that? What's the mechanism?
It's because the social structure is entirely different. It's not transactional, it's relational. Rural life is typically characterized by an extremely strong social fabric built on responsibility and reciprocity, mutual obligation. Unlike the anonymous city, the rural community relies heavily on shared effort and mutual support. It has to function. Neighbors actively help each other during planting season, during harvest time. They might assist with community beautification projects, or everyone pitches in for local festivals. Now, this structure, it offers a profound sense of rootedness, of belonging, but it comes at a cost, or rather a requirement. Commitment. This isn't passive belonging where you just happen to live there. It requires social obligation. Things like attending local neighborhood meetings, contributing your labor to community initiatives, always showing up for community events. But the flip side is, if you commit, the community commits back to you. You become part of the system.
Let's talk practicalities then. Living challenges, opportunities. Financially, the Inaka sounds incredibly appealing.
Massively so. Yes, amenities are definitely scarcer. You might struggle to find international ingredients for cooking or specialized imported products, but the financial trade-off is often the biggest motivator for people moving out there. Housing is dramatically more affordable. It's night and day compared to Tokyo. You can find these spacious, traditional homes, they're called kaminka, often with a garden or even a bit of land for farming. In prefectures like, say, Yamanashi or Kumamoto, you might find these renting for as little as $30,000 to $70,000 per month. That's what, a stunning $200 to $500 USD. Compared to a tiny, expensive apartment in central Tokyo, this affordability is genuinely transformative for quality of life.
But that transportation headache you mentioned, that sounds real. And it forces a level of linguistic engagement the city maybe doesn't require for day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Job options can be limited outside of specific areas like agriculture, small-scale tourism, or maybe government-sponsored education programs, like the JET program, which places young foreigners in local schools. That's a common route. But the real structural barrier is often transport. Rural areas usually have minimal bus or train services, maybe just a couple a day. Relying on expensive taxis just isn't sustainable long-term. So owning a car becomes almost a necessity, not a luxury, a necessity. And driving immediately introduces this unavoidable linguistic challenge. You have to read Japanese. Traffic signs, navigation instructions, local parking signs. This is a level of immersion far beyond just having a basic conversation. It requires literacy for survival on the road, where mistakes can be costly or even dangerous.
Okay, so summing that up, the city offers high convenience and career options, but potentially high isolation, and demands high language proficiency for deep connections and maybe career advancement. Whereas the countryside demands high language proficiency right up front for basic survival and mobility, but rewards that effort with potentially much deeper, immediate social inclusion if you participate. Right? That sets the stage perfectly for that moment of connection I experienced in Seo, that feeling of shared humanity just completely overriding the language barrier. How do you actually bypass that linguistic hurdle, sometimes instantly? How do you transcend the need for verbal fluency? The research really points towards the Japanese traditional festival, the Matsuri, as being this kind of ultimate pathway.
Yeah, the Matsuri provides this incredible, sanctioned, structured mechanism for integration, specifically through profound shared physical experience. Now, these festivals, they have deep cultural roots in Shintoism, often linked to animism, the changing seasons, primal energies. They might be meant to celebrate a good harvest or appease a local deity, a kami, but sociologically, their modern purpose is just as critical, maybe more so for integration. There are these designated moments to forget the constraints and hierarchies of everyday life, to reunite neighbors and relatives who might have moved away, and really reaffirm that local identity. It's a moment of communal physical release, shared effort, and kind of rerooting yourself in the community.
And for a foreigner, it seems like participation is the absolute key. You can't just stand on the sidelines and watch. You have to actually join in.
Participation is everything, especially in the tight social fabric of rural areas. Whether it's something smaller, like joining a neighborhood gardening association, or much more potently, participating in the main festival parade. It signals genuine commitment, respect. And the most powerful example of this, as you experienced, is being invited to help bear the mikoshi.
Okay, explain the mikoshi a bit more. What exactly is it, and what does it symbolize when you carry it?
Sure. The mikoshi is essentially a portable shrine. It's usually this elaborate, ornate palanquin, beautifully decorated. It's designed to be a temporary, physical vehicle for the local shrine's deity, the kami. So when the community carries it through the streets, they are literally carrying their local god through their community, blessing the area. And this is a deeply communal activity, and importantly, it's physically grueling. These things are heavy, the process is intense, requires coordination. So for a foreigner, being asked to bear the mikoshi, which is often an unusual invitation, sometimes quite selective, it immediately transcends the need for verbal fluency. It just cuts right through it. The shared physical strain, the absolute necessity of maintaining a synchronized rhythm with your neighbors under that heavy load, and the communal effort towards this profound spiritual and social goal. It creates an instantaneous sense of belonging that, honestly, no language course could ever replicate. You are literally bound together by sweat and shared effort.
It's like the ultimate nonverbal contract, right? You're physically relying on the person next to you, and they are relying on you wordlessly.
Exactly. It's this raw demonstration of mutual trust and capability that just strips away all the linguistic pretense. Who cares if you can conjugate verbs perfectly at that moment? This shared, intense, physical vulnerability. That's what accelerates the shift from being an outsider to, at least temporarily, an insider. And furthermore, there are these highly visible inclusion signals that really reinforce this integration during the festival. Foreigners are almost always encouraged, sometimes even required, to put on the traditional happy coat. It's like a short cotton kimono, often with the local shrine's crest or the neighborhood's name on it. Now, this garment is typically worn by the Ujiko, who are the members of the official shrine residence organization. So the simple act of wearing the happy coat is this visible, unambiguous statement of affiliation with the group and the effort.
Ah, okay. So the happy coat isn't just clothing. It's basically a uniform that says, okay, I'm part of this group for today, and I accept the social contract of this effort.
Precisely. It clarifies your affiliation and your intent. It signals you've moved past being just a tourist observer, and you're performing the beauties of a community member, at least for the duration of the festival. And while complex language is irrelevant during the carrying, basic vocal participation is still essential. Joining in the chanting of these ritual phrases like washoi or oisa. These are rhythmic shouts meant to synchronize the carriers and keep morale up that creates this profound, visceral, instantaneous sense of unity with everyone around you.
Right, that shared experience, that collective effort and rhythm, it all culminates in the kind of hospitality that mirrors that moment in Seo, right? The shared food, the drinks, the spontaneous laughter.
Yes, the dinner party or gathering afterwards is the critical sociological closing mechanism. It seals the deal, so to speak. After the initial, maybe slightly more formal parts, the official discourses, the congratulations, the communal kampai toasts where everyone raises their drink together, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. It becomes jovial, maybe a bit tipsy, and profoundly welcoming. The shared memory of the effort everyone just went through carrying the deity together, rather than any kind of linguistic mastery, that's what cements the connection. And this is where that shared humanity really comes through. That moment of clumsy translation and spontaneous laughter you described, that is the currency. The connection gets solidified not through perfect vocabulary, but through relaxed, unguarded hospitality that follows a shared, meaningful goal.
And you're saying this framework, this idea of participation leading to belonging, it actually applies even in the giant cities like Tokyo.
It does. It really does. Despite the sheer vastness of urban centers like Tokyo, neighborhoods still function as smaller, often highly structured social units. Little villages within the metropolis. So for a foreigner to truly break through that isolation paradox we talked about earlier, even in Tokyo, they often need to actively seek out and join a local association, maybe a volunteer group, a local cultural club, or even helping out with their neighborhood Matsuri initiative if there is one. Just living nearby, proximity is often irrelevant for deep connection. It is active participation and contribution that define true belonging, even within the seeming anonymity of the megalopolis. Okay, so now we need to kind of zoom out. Let's move beyond Japan specifically and analyze the broader psychological and sociological rules that seem to govern language expectations globally. The core question, connecting back to your experience, is why did the lack of Japanese in the high-status city of Tokyo feel like such a personal failure? While the same lack of Japanese in the, let's say, lower-status perception of a rural area like Seio instantly led to acceptance, humor, and connection. The answer seems to hinge on two really intertwined concepts from sociology and communication studies: cultural capital and communication accommodation theory.
Okay, cultural capital. Let's start by defining that status differential. How does a tourist's willingness to adapt, or maybe their refusal to adapt, depend on the cultural capital they assign to the host country or city?
Right. So cultural capital in this specific context relates to the symbolic resources and prestige associated with a particular nation, language, or culture. This is often heavily influenced by things like historical power, current economic strength, global media perception, think movies, music, fashion. Now, when tourists visit locations that are generally perceived as having high cultural capital, classic examples are Paris, Madrid, maybe Florence, Kyoto. The status dynamic often reverses the usual linguistic power relationship we talked about earlier with English. The tourist feels this kind of internalized obligation, even if it's minor, to perform some effort to converge with the local language and customs, to try and fit in a little. They implicitly understand that the local culture holds an intrinsic high status, a prestige, that their own economic status as a tourist or their linguistic capital as an English speaker might not automatically supersede. They feel a need to show respect.
Can you give us a specific example of this kind of convergence in a high cultural capital environment?
Absolutely. Take Paris. Paris as this global center of art, fashion, history, haute cuisine. It possesses immense cultural capital, right? It's almost mythical. Tourists often anticipate, sometimes even actively fear lacking French fluency. They feel compelled, almost obligated, to learn a strict set of polite phrases. Bonjour, merci, s'il vous plaît. And crucially, always starting an inquiry with, parlez-vous anglais? Do you speak English? Almost apologetically. They see this as a necessary performance, a social ritual to earn respect and tolerance from Parisians. And critically, the expectation of local fluency in English is low. The fact that many locals, especially outside tourist hotspots, don't speak English fluently is anticipated by the tourists, and it's often excused. In fact, our sources noted something interesting. Tourists often actively downplay their disappointment about finding, say, a lack of English TV channels in their Paris hotel rooms. Because they don't want to be perceived as demanding or disrespectful of French culture, they perform humility to fit in.
So, their attempt at speaking French, however basic, it's less about actual communication and maybe more about a social transaction, designed to show respect and reduce that social distance.
Precisely. It's a clear act of convergence, which, under communication accommodation theory, means you adapt your language, your mannerisms to resemble those of the person you're talking to in order to foster social integration and liking. They're signaling, essentially. I value your culture. I recognize its status. And we see the same pattern emerging in places like Madrid. Tourists are frequently advised, look, just attempting a few basic Spanish words, however clumsy, will encourage the locals to meet you halfway. The tourist understands that Spanish is the official language of a major European capital with high status, and the lack of English proficiency among some service staff is generally accepted because, Well, it was anticipated and rationalized by the city's high cultural standing. Of course they speak Spanish here. It's Madrid.
Okay, so that's the high cultural capital dynamic. Now, where does this flip? When does the linguistic privilege the English speakers suddenly take precedence again?
Right, the dynamic flips entirely, almost 180 degrees, when tourists visit places perceived to have low cultural capital. Now, this perception is subjective, of course, and often linked to economic development or media portrayal, regardless of the actual richness of the local culture. Locations frequently cited in tourism studies showing this pattern include certain resort destinations in the Caribbean, like Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, or parts of Southeast Asia, like Phuket in Thailand, or sometimes even large, rapidly developing nations where the tourist feels a sense of otherness, maybe like Beijing for some Western tourists. In these locations, tourists often assume a dominant position based primarily on their linguistic capital, their English proficiency, and often more importantly, their economic status as the paying customer. They shift from convergence, trying to fit in, to divergence, meaning they subtly or overtly emphasize their difference, and they expect the locals to fully accommodate them. The burden shifts.
Okay, how does this expectation manifest itself in practice, say, in a place like Punta Cana?
Well, in Punta Cana, for instance, research shows tourists often view their attempts to speak Spanish very differently than in Madrid. It's not seen as genuine communication necessarily, but more as a kind of benevolent gesture or even an investment that is explicitly expected to yield quantifiable economic returns. They might use a few Spanish phrases specifically to try and secure better service, negotiate better prices, or elicit more appreciation from the staff, and often this use of Spanish is linked directly to the size of the tip they give. Language becomes a tool leveraged as economic capital, and unfortunately, this low-status perception can also lead to the projection of negative, harmful stereotypes onto the local population. Tourists in these studies sometimes rely on these deeply problematic, generalized descriptions. You see things like Punta Cana Dominicans described as happy dancing poor people, or Phuket Thais as smiling, childlike, maybe needing external motivation or a kick up the bum to perform tasks efficiently. Just awful stuff.
Yeah, that is uncomfortable territory, but it's really critical to understanding that perception gap, isn't it? So in this framework, complaining about a language barrier, it's not seen as a reflection on the tourist's lack of preparation, is it?
Not at all. It's completely flipped. In the high cultural capital scenario, like Paris, the failure to communicate is often implicitly seen as the tourist's fault for not learning the language of the prestigious host culture. But in the perceived low cultural capital scenario, like Phuket, complaints about the lack of English are framed as incompetence or laziness on the part of the local staff. The staff failed to meet the tourist's expectation of accommodation. It's no longer framed as a cultural exchange. It's framed as demanding immediate, high-quality service based on the tourist's perceived linguistic and economic superiority.
And this high expectation of accommodation, this demand for service in English, is what leads directly to the creation of that environmental bubble you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. The environmental bubble theory basically states that tourists often seek to be physically transported to a foreign land while remaining psychologically and sometimes physically cocooned inside a protective bubble of their own native culture. They end up viewing the host society through these thick walls of extreme familiarity. And in those low cultural capital destinations or destinations perceived as very culturally distant or third world, the high bubble expectation is intense. Tourists actively seek out the familiar. They demand English TV channels in their rooms. They actively look for familiar Western food chains. McDonald's, Starbucks, Pizza Hut become safe havens. In places like the Caribbean, they explicitly choose those all-inclusive resorts, which are structurally designed to be isolated, self-contained enclaves with minimal need for interaction with the local environment outside the resort gates.
Right, and the ultimate irony there is that a tourist sitting in a McDonald's in Beijing, seeking that familiar American home feeling, they're still interacting primarily with local Chinese staff, probably sitting among local Chinese clientele. But the perception of safety, of familiarity, that remains intact for them.
That's the key psychological function of the bubble. The global spread of these Western chains, it kind of blurs the line between what's local and what's foreign. But for the tourists seeking that bubble, the primary goal is safety, predictability, and the feeling of stepping back into an easy, non-challenging environment where they don't have to struggle. The expectation of accommodation, which they establish through their prior research and their perceived status, dictates their comfort level. And that comfort level, in turn, dictates their willingness or lack thereof to actually engage with the real, complex, local culture outside the bubble.
Okay, so pulling that back to my Tokyo experience, Tokyo is clearly a high cultural capital environment. So my high-status English language capital was, in that moment at the ticket machine, temporarily neutralized, overridden by the host culture's even higher perceived status and its complex, non-accommodating structure. It shattered my implicit environmental bubble expectation. It's fundamentally a clash of privilege, wasn't it?
Precisely. And the structure of the city itself, that efficient, anonymous nature of the train system, was designed for high volume, high speed transactions among people who already know the system. It wasn't designed for the slow, messy, high context process of cross cultural communication with a confused foreigner. So the environment itself reinforced that feeling of isolation when your privilege didn't automatically grant you access. So, to kind of summarize our deep dive here, language proficiency, while obviously absolutely essential for complex, high-stress communication, dealing with bureaucracy, medical issues, advancing in your career, it's often secondary to these factors of perceived status and shared experience when it comes to determining successful cultural integration and genuine human connection. The willingness of a traveler to accommodate, to converge, to try and fit in, or conversely, their expectation that others should accommodate them. It seems fundamentally tied to the cultural capital they subconsciously assign to the host culture.
Yeah, and we saw this tension play out perfectly in those two contrasting Japanese experiences I had. The intense isolation I felt in Tokyo, it really stemmed from that clash between my ingrained, often unconscious linguistic privilege as an English speaker and the complex reality of this highly structured, high cultural capital environment, Tokyo, which simply wasn't obligated to accommodate my linguistic needs instantly, especially not in a busy train station. And the anonymity of the city's structure just exacerbated that feeling of being completely outside the system. But then the genuine connection I found in rural Seyo, that was forged in purely shared, nonverbal effort, whether it was the profound, sweaty physical labor of bearing the mikoshi alongside my neighbors, or just that immediate, spontaneous laughter over a ridiculously clumsy translation app, that felt like a successful act of mutual accommodation. The local community, which clearly valued physical presence, participation, and shared humanity, they prioritized that effort over my total lack of linguistic competence in that moment.
And that really gets to the heart of it. Connection is fundamentally built on participation, on showing respect for local status and ways of doing things, and crucially, on shared vulnerability, not just on verbal fluency. Now, the global spread of English grants immense power, immense privilege to its native speakers. It's a linguistic capital that opens professional doors and simplifies travel worldwide, no doubt about it. But true, profound, cross-cultural communication, the kind that leads to real belonging, it often requires the voluntary, temporary suspension of that power, that privilege. It requires a willingness to step outside that protective environmental bubble, however uncomfortable it feels initially, and allow the simple human act of shared effort, like synchronizing your steps under a heavy shrine, or finding mutual humor in a ridiculous translation, to become the real, universal currency of connection.